George Raymond Richard Martin, also known as GRRM, is an American novelist, screenwriter, television producer, and short story writer. He is the author of the series of epic fantasy novels A Song of Ice and Fire, which were adapted into the Emmy Award-winning HBO series Game of Thrones and its prequel series House of the Dragon. He also helped create the Wild Cards anthology series, and contributed world building for the 2022 video game Elden Ring. In 2005, Lev Grossman of Time called Martin the American Tolkien, and in 2011, he was included on the annual Time 100 list of the most influential people in the world. Early life. George Raymond Martin was born on September 20, 1948, in Bayonne, New Jersey, the son of longshoreman Raymond Collins Martin and Margaret Brady Martin. His mother's family had once been wealthy, owning a successful construction business, but lost it all in the Great Depression, something Martin was reminded about every day when he passed what used to be his family's dock and house. He has two younger sisters, Darlene and Janet. He is predominantly of Irish descent. A DNA test on the series Finding Your Roots showed him to be 53.6% British and Irish, 22.4% Ashkenazi Jewish, and 15.6% broadly Northwestern European. The family first lived in a house on Broadway belonging to Martin's great-grandmother. In 1953, they moved to a federal housing project near the Bayonne docks. During Martin's childhood, his world consisted predominantly of 1st Street to 5th Street, between his grade school and his home. This limited world made him want to travel and experience other places, but the only way of doing so was through his imagination, and he became a voracious reader. Martin began writing and selling monster stories for pennies to other neighborhood children, dramatic readings included. He also wrote stories about a mythical kingdom populated by his pet turtles. The turtles died frequently in their toy castle, so he decided they were killing each other off in sinister plots. Martin had a habit of starting endless stories that he never completed, as they did not turn out as well on paper as he had imagined them. Martin attended Mary Jane Donahoe School and later Marist High School. While there he became an avid comic book fan, developing a strong interest in the superheroes being published by Marvel Comics, and later credited Stan Lee for being one of his greatest literary influences. Maybe Stan Lee is the greatest literary influence on me, even more than Shakespeare or Tolkien. A letter Martin wrote to the editor of Fantastic Four was printed in issue number 20, it was the first of many sent, e.g., Fantastic Four number 32, number 34, and others. Fans who read his letters wrote him letters in turn, and through such contacts, Martin joined the fledgling comics fandom of the era, writing fiction for various fanzines. He bought the first ticket to the world's first Comic-Con, held in New York in 1964. In 1965, Martin won Comic Fandom's Alley Award for Best Fan Fiction for his prose superhero story Powerman vs. The Blue Barrier. In 1970, Martin earned a B.S. in journalism from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism in Evanston, Illinois, graduating summa cum laude. He went on to complete his M.S. in journalism in 1971, also from Medill. Eligible for the draft during the Vietnam War, to which he objected, Martin applied for and obtained conscientious objector status. He instead did alternative service work for 2 years as a VISTA volunteer, attached to the Cook County Legal Assistance Foundation. Career. Early writing career. Martin began selling science fiction short stories professionally in 1970, at age 21. His first sale was The Hero, sold to Galaxy magazine and published in its February 1971 issue. Other sales soon followed. His first story to be nominated for the Hugo Award and Nebula Awards was With Morning Comes Mist Fall, published in 1973 in Analog magazine. In 1975 his story, for a single yesterday about a post-apocalyptic time tripper was selected for inclusion in Epoch, a science fiction anthology edited by Roger Elwood and Robert Silverberg. His first novel, Dying of the Light, was completed in 1976 right before he moved to Dubuque and published in 1977. That same year the enormous success of Star Wars had a huge impact on the publishing industry and science fiction, and he sold the novel for the same amount he would make in 3 years of teaching. The short stories he was able to sell in his early 20s gave him some profit, but not enough to pay his bills, which prevented him from becoming the full-time writer he wanted to be. The need for a day job occurred simultaneously with the American chess craze which followed Bobby Fischer's victory in the 1972 World Chess Championship. Martin's own chess skills and experience allowed him to be hired as a tournament director for the Continental Chess Association that ran chess tournaments on the weekends. This gave him a sufficient income, and because the tournaments only ran on Saturdays and Sundays, it allowed him to work as a writer 5 days a week from 1973 to 1976. By the time the chess bubble subsequently burst and no longer provided an income, he had become much better established as a writer. Teaching. In the mid-1970s, Martin met English professor George Guthridge from Dubuque, Iowa, at a science fiction convention in Milwaukee. Martin persuaded Guthridge not only to give speculative fiction a second look, but to write in the field himself. Guthridge has since been a finalist for the Hugo Award and twice for the Nebula Award for Science Fiction and Fantasy. In 1998, Guthridge and Janet Berliner won the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in the novel for their Children of the Dusk. In turn, Guthridge helped Martin in finding a job at Clark University. Martin wasn't making enough money to stay alive from writing and the chess tournaments, says Guthridge. From 1976 to 1978, Martin was an English and journalism instructor at Clark, and he became writer-in-residence at the college from 1978 to 1979. Concentration on writing. While he enjoyed teaching, the sudden death of friend and fellow author Tom Reamy in late 1977 made Martin re-evaluate his own life, and he eventually decided to try to become a full-time writer. When his wife graduated from Clark in 1979, he resigned from his job, and being tired of the hard winters in Dubuque, they moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, in 1979, which they had fallen in love with after a visit the year before on their way to the Worldcon in Phoenix. Martin is a member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. He served as the organization's Southwest Regional Director from 1977 to 1979, and as its Vice President from 1996 to 1998. In 1976, for Kansas City's Mid-Americon, the 34th World Science Fiction Convention, Martin and his friend and fellow writer-editor Gardner Dozois conceived of and organized the first Hugo Losers Party for the benefit of all past and present Hugo-losing writers on the evening following the convention's Hugo Awards ceremony. Martin was nominated for 2 Hugos that year but lost both awards, for the novelette, and 7 times Never Kill Man and the novella The Storms of Windhaven, co-written with Lisa Tuttle. Although Martin often writes fantasy or horror, a number of his earlier works are science fiction tales occurring in a loosely defined future history, known informally as the Thousand Worlds or the Manrealm. In 2017, Martin recalled that he had started writing science fiction horror hybrids in the late 1970s to disprove a statement from a critic claiming that science fiction and horror were opposites and therefore incompatible. Martin considered Sand Kings the best known of these. Another was the novella Night Flyers, whose screen and television rights were purchased by Vista in 1984, which produced a 1987 film adaptation, Night Flyers, with the screenplay co-written by Martin. Martin was unhappy about having to cut plot elements in order to accommodate the film's small budget. While not a hit at theaters, Martin believes that the film saved his career, and that everything he has written since exists in large part because of it. He has also written at least one piece of political military fiction, Night of the Vampires, collected in Harry Turtledove's anthology The Best Military Science Fiction of the 20th Century. In 1982, Martin published a vampire novel titled Fever Dream set in the 19th century on the Mississippi River. Unlike traditional vampire novels, in Fever Dream vampires are not supernatural creatures, but are rather a different species related to humans created by evolution with superhuman powers. Critic Don Diamassa has praised Fever Dream for its strong 19th-century atmosphere and wrote, "This is without question one of the greatest vampire novels of all time." Martin followed up Fever Dream with another horror novel, The Armageddon Rag. The unexpected commercial failure of The Armageddon Rag essentially destroyed my career as a novelist at the time, he recalled, and made him consider going into real estate instead. In 1984, the new editor of Baen Books, Betsy Mitchell, called Martin to ask him if he had considered doing a collection of Haviland Tough adventures. Martin, who had several favorite series characters like Solomon Kane, Elric, Nicholas Van Ryn and Magnus Rudolph, had made an attempt to create such a character on his own in the 1970s with his Tough stories. He was interested, but was too occupied with the writing of his next book, the never-completed novel Black and White and Red All Over, which occupied most of his writing time the same year. But after the failure of The Armageddon Rag, all editors rejected his upcoming novel, and desperate for money, he accepted Mitchell's offer and wrote some more Tough stories which were collected in Tough Voyaging, which sold well enough for Mitchell to suggest a sequel. Martin was willing and agreed to do it, but before he got started he got an offer from Hollywood, where producer Philip Diggory Jr. wanted to adapt The Armageddon Rag into a film. The film adaptation did not happen, but they stayed in touch, and when Diggory became the producer for the revival of The Twilight Zone, Martin was offered a job as a writer. Working for television paid a lot better than writing literature, so he decided to move to Hollywood to seek a new career. At first he worked as staff writer for the show, and then as an executive story consultant. After the CBS series was cancelled, Martin migrated over to the already underway satirical science fiction series Max Headroom. He worked on scripts and created the show's Ped Scene character. However, before his scripts could go into production, the ABC show was cancelled in the middle of its second season. Martin was hired as a writer-producer on the new dramatic fantasy series Beauty and the Beast. In 1989, he became the show's CO supervising producer and wrote 14 of its episodes. In 1987, Martin published a collection of short horror stories and portraits of his children. During this same period, Martin continued working in print media as a book series editor, this time overseeing the development of the multi-author Wild Cards book series, which takes place in a shared universe in which a small slice of post-World War II humanity gains superpowers after the release of an alien-engineered virus. New titles are published in the ongoing series from Tor Books. In second person, Martin gives a personal account of the close-knit role-playing game culture that gave rise to his Wild Cards shared world anthologies. An important element in the creation of the multiple-author series was a campaign of KSM's role-playing game Superworld that Martin ran in Albuquerque. Admitting he became completely obsessed with the game, he stopped writing literature for most of 1983, which he refers to as his lost year, but his shrinking bank accounts made him realize he had to come up with something, and got the idea that perhaps the stories and characters created in Superworld could somehow become profitable. Martin's own contributions to Wild Cards have included Thomas Tudbury, the Great and Powerful Turtle, a powerful psychokinetic whose flying shell consisted of an armored VW Beetle. As of June 2011, 21 Wild Cards volumes had been published in the series. Earlier that same year, Martin signed the contract for the 22nd volume, Low Ball, published by Tor Books. In early 2012, Martin signed another tour contract for the 23rd Wildcards volume, High Stakes, which was released in August 2016. In August 2016, Martin announced that Universal Cable Productions had acquired the rights to adapt the Wildcards novels into a television series. He noted that he himself would not write for the adaptation due to focusing on A Song of Ice and Fire. A Song of Ice and Fire / I. None. HBO adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire / I. None. Themes. Martin's work has been described as having complex storylines, fascinating characters, great dialogue, perfect pacing by literary critic Jeff Vandermeer. Dana Jennings of the New York Times described Martin's work as fantasy for grown-ups, and Lev Grossman wrote that it was dark and cynical. Martin's first novel, Dying of the Light, set the tone for some of his future work. It unfolds on a mostly abandoned planet that is slowly becoming uninhabitable as it moves away from its sun. This story has a strong sense of melancholy. His characters are often unhappy or, at least, unsatisfied, in many cases holding on to idealisms in spite of an otherwise chaotic and ruthless world, and often troubled by their own self-seeking or violent actions, even as they undertake them. Many have elements of tragic heroes or anti-heroes in them. Reviewer T.M. Wagner writes, "Let it never be said Martin doesn't share Shakespeare's fondness for the senselessly tragic. The overall gloominess of A Song of Ice and Fire can be an obstacle for some readers." The Inchoitus group writes that, if this absence of joy is going to trouble you, or you're looking for something more affirming, then you should probably seek elsewhere. However, for many fans, it is precisely this level of realness and completeness, including many characters' imperfections, moral and ethical ambiguity, and consequential plot twists, that is endearing about Martin's work. Many find that this is what makes the series' story arcs compelling enough to keep following despite its sheer brutality and intricately messy and interwoven plot lines. As trademark Wagner points out, there's great tragedy here, but there's also excitement, humor, heroism even in weaklings, nobility even in villains, and, now and then, a taste of justice after all. It's a rare gift when a writer can invest his story with that much humanity. Martin's characters are multifaceted, each with intricate pasts, aspirations, and ambitions. Publishers Weekly writes of his ongoing epic fantasy A Song of Ice and Fire, the complexity of characters such as Daenerys, Arya, and the Kingslayer will keep readers turning. Even the vast number of pages contained in this volume, for the author, like Tolkien or Jordan, makes us care about their fates. Misfortune, injury, and death often befall major or minor characters, no matter how attached the reader has become. Martin has described his penchant for killing off important characters as being necessary for the story's depth. "When my characters are in danger, I want you to be afraid to turn the page. You need to show right from the beginning that you're playing for keeps." In distinguishing his work from others, Martin makes a point of emphasizing realism and plausible social dynamics above an over-reliance on magic and a simplistic good versus evil dichotomy, for which contemporary fantasy writing is often criticized. Notably, Martin's work makes a sharp departure from the prevalent heroic knights and chivalry schema that has become a mainstay in fantasy as derived from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. He specifically critiques the oversimplification of Tolkien's themes and devices by imitators in ways that he has humorously described as Disneyland Middle Ages, which gloss over or ignore major differences between medieval and modern societies, particularly social structures, ways of living, and political arrangements. Martin has been described as the American Tolkien by literary critics. While Martin finds inspiration in Tolkien's legacy, he aims to go beyond what he sees as Tolkien's medieval philosophy of if the king was a good man, the land would prosper, to delve into the complexities, ambiguities, and vagaries of real-life power. We look at real history and it's not that simple. Just having good intentions doesn't make you a wise king. For this fact, Martin has been credited with the rise of grim-dark fantasy, a modern form of an anti-Tolkien approach to fantasy writing which, according to British science fiction and fantasy novelist Adam Roberts, is characterized by its reaction to Tolkien's idealism even though it owes a lot to Tolkien's work. The Canadian fantasy writer R. Scott Backer says he wouldn't have been able to publish his fantasy novels without the success George R. Martin achieved first. Similarly, Mark Lawrence, author of Prince of Thorns, was inspired by Martin and impressed by his red wedding scene. The author makes a point of grounding his work on a foundation of historical fiction, which he channels to evoke important social and political elements of primarily the European medieval era that differ markedly from elements of modern times, including the multi-generational, rigid, and often brutally consequential nature of the hierarchical class system of feudal societies that is in many cases overlooked in fantasy writing. Even as A Song of Ice and Fire is a fantasy series that employs magic and the surreal as central to the genre, Martin is keen to ensure that magic is merely one element of many that moves his work forward, not a generic deus ex machina that is itself the focus of his stories, which is something he has been very conscious about since reading Tolkien. If you look at The Lord of the Rings, what strikes you, it certainly struck me, is that although the world is infused with this great sense of magic, there is very little on-stage magic. So you have a sense of magic, but it's kept under very tight control, and I really took that to heart when I was starting my own series. Martin's ultimate aim is an exploration of the internal conflicts that define the human condition, which, in deriving inspiration from William Faulkner, he ultimately describes as the only reason to read any literature, regardless of genre. In 2018, Martin called The Lord of the Rings, The Great Gatsby, Gone with the Wind, Great Expectations, Lonesome Dove, Catch-22, and Charlotte's Web favorites, all towering masterpieces, books that changed my life. Producing. In 2017, Martin confirmed he would serve as an executive producer of the HBO television series adaptation of the 2010 science fantasy novel Who Fears Death by D. Okorafor. Martin also contributed to the 2022 video game titled Elden Ring, writing the world-building aspects for it. In February 2021, it was reported that Martin and Kalinda Vazquez were developing a TV adaptation of Road Marks by Roger Zelazny, which Martin pitched to HBO in 2020. Martin will be an executive producer, Vazquez the showrunner, writer, and executive producer. In March 2021, he signed an overall deal with HBO. Martin will serve as an executive producer of the Peacock TV adaptation in development of his Wild Cards book series, together with Melinda M. Snodgrass and Vince Girardes, Martin's manager. He will serve as an executive producer of the 2022 AMC series Dark Winds based on Tony Hillerman's Leaphorn and Chi books, together with the creator Graham Rowland, the showrunner Vince Calandra, the lead Zahn McLarnon, Kiowa Gordon, Chris Eyre, Robert Redford, Tina Elmo, and Vince Girardes. In 2021, Martin served as one of the producers of the short film Night of the Cooters based on the eponymous short story by Howard Waldrop. Relationship with fans. Martin actively contributes to his blog, Not a Blog. In April 2018 he moved his blog from LiveJournal to his own website. Martin's official fan club is the Brotherhood Without Banners, which has a regular posting board at the forum of the website westeros.org, which is focused on his A Song of Ice and Fire fantasy series. At the annual World Science Fiction Convention every year, the Brotherhood Without Banners hosts a large, ongoing hospitality suite that is open to all members of the Worldcon. Martin is opposed to fan fiction, which he views as copyright infringement and a bad exercise for aspiring writers in terms of developing skills in world building and character development. Conventions. Martin is known for his regular attendance at science fiction conventions and comics conventions, and his accessibility to fans. In the early 1980s, critic and writer Thomas Dish identified Martin as a member of the Labor Day group, writers who regularly congregated at the annual Worldcon, usually held on or around the Labor Day weekend. Since the early 1970s, he has also attended regional science fiction conventions. Further, since 1986, Martin has participated annually in Albuquerque's smaller regional convention Bubonicon, near his New Mexico home. He was the guest of honor at the 61st World Science Fiction Convention in Toronto, held in 2003. In December 2016, Martin was a key speaker at the Guadalajara International Book Fair 2016 in Mexico, where the author provided hints about the next two books in the series A Song of Ice and Fire. In 2020, Martin gave a speech at the Hugo Awards event in which he mispronounced several names, including that of R.F. Kuang, which she considered a microaggression. Martin later apologized for mispronouncing the names. Criticism. Martin has been criticized by some of his readers for the long periods between books in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, notably the 6-year gap between the 4th volume, A Feast for Crows, and the 5th volume, A Dance with Dragons. In 2010, Martin had responded to fan criticisms by saying he was unwilling to write only his A Song of Ice and Fire series, noting that working on other prose and compiling and editing different book projects have always been part of his working process. Writer Neil Gaiman famously wrote on his blog in 2009 to a critic of Martin's pace, "George R.R. Martin is not your bitch." Gaiman later went on to state that writers are not machines and that they have every right to work on other projects if they want to. Personal life. In the early 1970s, Martin was in a relationship with fellow science fiction/fantasy author Lisa Tuttle, with whom he co-wrote Windhaven. While attending an East Coast science fiction convention, he met his first wife, Gail Binnick. They were married in 1975. The marriage ended in divorce in 1979, without issue, just before they were meant to move to Santa Fe together. Instead, he settled there alone from December that same year until September 1981, when what would be his longtime partner Paris McBride moved in with him. On February 15, 2011, Martin married McBride during a small ceremony at their Santa Fe home. On August 19, 2011, they held a larger wedding ceremony and reception at Renovation, the 69th World Science Fiction Convention. He and McBride are supporters of the Wild Spirit Wolf Sanctuary in New Mexico. In early 2013, he purchased Santa Fe's Jean Cocteau Cinema and Coffee House, which had been closed since 2006. He had the property completely restored, including both its original 35mm capability, to which was added digital projection and sound. The Cocteau officially reopened for business on August 9, 2013. In 2019, he opened a bookstore named Beastly Books, after Beauty and the Beast, next to Jean Cocteau. Martin has also supported Meow Wolf, an arts collective in Santa Fe, having pledged $2.7 million toward a new art space in January 2015. In response to a question on his religious views, Martin replied, "I suppose I'm a lapsed Catholic. You would consider me an atheist or agnostic. I find religion and spirituality fascinating. I would like to believe this isn't the end and there's something more, but I can't convince the rational part of me that makes any sense whatsoever." Martin is a fan of the New York Jets, the New York Giants and the New York Mets. He is also a fan of the Grateful Dead, and says that the band's music may have influenced his work. Martin made a guest appearance as himself in an episode, El Skeletorito, of the Adult Swim show Robot Chicken. He also appeared in Sci-Fi's Z Nation as a zombie version of himself in Season 2's The Collector, where he is still signing copies of his new novel. In Sharknado 3, Oh Hell No, he is killed when watching a movie at the theater. Philanthropy. In 2014, Martin launched a campaign on Prizeo to raise funds for Wild Spirit Wolf Sanctuary and the Food Depot of Santa Fe. As part of the campaign, Martin offered one donor the chance to accompany him on a trip to the wolf sanctuary, including a helicopter ride and dinner. Martin also offered those donating $20,000 or more the opportunity to have a character named after them and killed off in an upcoming A Song of Ice and Fire novel. The campaign garnered media attention and raised a total of $502,549. In 2017, Martin announced that he was funding the Miskatonic Scholarship. The Miskatonic Scholarship allows a writer of Lovecraftian cosmic horror to attend the Odyssey Workshop, a 6-week writing workshop held at St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire. Politics. Growing up, Martin avoided the draft to the Vietnam War by being a conscientious objector and did 2 years of alternative service. He generally opposes war and thought the Vietnam War was a terrible mistake for America. He has also written against the glory of war and tries to describe war realistically in his books. While he did not endorse Barack Obama in 2008, Martin endorsed him for re-election in 2012, calling Obama the most intelligent president since Jimmy Carter. In 2014, Martin endorsed Democratic Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico. In the midst of pressure to pull the 2014 feature film The Interview from theaters, the Jean Cocteau Cinema in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which has been owned by Martin since 2013, decided to show the film. Theater manager John Bowman told the Santa Fe New Mexican, "Martin feels strongly about the First Amendment and the idea of artists having the ability to speak their minds and not having to worry about being targets." On November 20, 2015, writing on his LiveJournal blog, Martin advocated for allowing Syrian refugees into the United States. Immediately following Bernie Sanders' defeat in the U.S. Democratic primary election, he supported Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton in the general 2016 United States presidential election, and criticized Donald Trump during the election and following her defeat, commenting that Trump would become the worst president in American history. In response to fans of Martin who compared Trump favorably to characters from A Song of Ice and Fire, Martin doubled down on his criticism of Trump by making the case to his fans that Trump shares many personality traits in common with King Joffrey, a near-universally hated character from the series, concluding that Trump is a grown-up Joffrey. In May 2019, Martin endorsed Joe Biden for president in 2020. Awards. 1975 Hugo Award for Best Novella for A Song for Laya. 1976 Locus Award for Best Novella for The Storms of Windhaven. 1977 Locus Award for Best Author Collection for A Song for Laya and Other Stories. 1979 Nebula Award for Best Novelette for Sand Kings. 1980 Hugo Award for Best Novelette for Sand Kings. 1980 Hugo Award for Best Short Story for The Way of Cross and Dragon. 1980 Locus Award for Best Short Story for The Way of Cross and Dragon. 1980 Locus Award for Best Novelette for Sand Kings. 1981 Locus Award for Best Novella for Night Flyers. 1982 Locus Award for Best Single Author Collection for Sand Kings. 1982 Locus Award for Best Novelette for Guardians. 1984 Locus Award for Best Novelette for The Monkey Treatment. 1985 Nebula Award for Best Novelette for Portraits of His Children. 1988 Inkpot Award. 1988 Bram Stoker Award for Long Fiction for The Pear-Shaped Man. 1989 World Fantasy Award for Best Novella for The Skin Trade. 1997 Hugo Award for Best Novella for Blood of the Dragon. 1997 Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel for A Game of Thrones. 1999 Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel for A Clash of Kings. 2001 Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel for A Storm of Swords. 2003 Premio Ignotus for Best Foreign Novel for A Game of Thrones. 2004 Premio Ignotus for Best Foreign Novel for A Clash of Kings. 2006 Premio Ignotus for Best Foreign Novel for A Storm of Swords. 2011 Locus Award for Best Original Anthology for Warriors. 2011 Goodreads Choice Award Best Fantasy for A Dance with Dragons. Declared by Time one of the most influential people of 2011. 2012 Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel for A Dance with Dragons. 2012 Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, Long Form for Game of Thrones, Season 1. 2012 World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement. 2013 Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, Short Form for Game of Thrones, Season 2, Episode 9, Blackwater. 2014 Locus Award for Best Original Anthology for Old Mars. 2014 World Fantasy Award for Best Original Anthology for Dangerous Women. 2015 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series Game of Thrones, Season 5. 2015 Northwestern University Medill Hall of Achievement Award. 2015 Locus Award for Best Original Anthology for Rogues. 2016 Locus Award for Best Original Anthology for Old Venus. 2016 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series Game of Thrones, Season 6. 2018 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series Game of Thrones, Season 7. 2019 New Jersey Hall of Fame induction. 2019 and Post International Recognition Award. 2019 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series Game of Thrones, Season 8. 2021 Honorary Doctorate, Northwestern University. Nominations: 1988 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series for Beauty and the Beast. 1989 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series for Beauty and the Beast. 1997 Nebula Award for Best Novel for A Game of Thrones. 1999 Nebula Award for Best Novel for A Clash of Kings. 2001 Nebula Award for Best Novel for A Storm of Swords. 2001 Hugo Award for Best Novel for A Storm of Swords. 2006 Hugo Award for Best Novel for A Feast for Crows. 2006 Quill Award for A Feast for Crows. British Fantasy Award for A Feast for Crows. 2011 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series for Game of Thrones, Season 1. 2012 Hugo Award for Best Novel for A Dance with Dragons. 2012 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series for Game of Thrones, Season 2. 2013 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series for Game of Thrones, Season 3. 2014 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Drama Series for Game of Thrones, Season 4. Bibliography. Works: novels, children's novels, short stories. Editor: New Voices in Science Fiction. New Voices in Science Fiction 2. New Voices in Science Fiction 3. New Voices in Science Fiction 4. The Science Fiction Weight Loss Book edited with Isaac Asimov and Martin H. Greenberg. The John W. Campbell Awards, Volume 5. Night Visions 3. iWildcards/I Series Editor. None. Cross-genre anthologies edited. Filmography. Film.